I now give the floor to Clarissa Ward, CNN Senior International Correspondent.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Power, the UN Security Council, Dr. Attar, Dr. Sahlul. It's an honor to be here next to you. I first visited Aleppo in the summer of 2012, and I remember the drive towards the city. The closer you got to it, the less power there was, and we drove along in this sort of tense silence with this eerie darkness all around us. But as you got closer, you started to hear sounds, the sounds of shelling. At first a dull thud, then louder and louder. Eventually we reached a place called, in Rif Halab, the area surrounding Aleppo, called Haytan. And by now the shelling was no longer a dull thud. It was artillery landing just a few hundred meters away from us. We grabbed our gear and dove into the basement of the house where we were staying, where we were the guests of several Syrian families. The men sat in one room, chain smoking and bickering amongst each other. It almost felt like it was a way for them to distract themselves from the prospect of death, which seemed to hover all around us. I went and sat with the women. Some of them prayed, some wept. One woman clutched a cushion and rocked back and forth. Most of them sat like me in suspended silence, just waiting. It's hard to describe the agony of that waiting. At around 2 a.m., the shelling finally stopped and we crawled into bed, exhausted. And then just a few hours later at 5 a.m., the planes started buzzing overhead. And it's really difficult to describe the pit that forms in your stomach when you hear those planes, because you know something terrible is about to happen, but you have no idea where it's going to happen. You're paralyzed. And I looked around the room at the rest of my colleagues, and my driver, a Syrian man from Tel Rifat, Ayman, looked at me and we made eye contact and he kind of just shrugged. Allahu alam, only God knows. And we both understood in that moment that we were absolutely powerless to protect ourselves. And moments later, the room shook as the plane dropped a barrel bomb, and you heard the doctors talking about barrel bombs nearby. The target, in fact, appeared to be a hospital. Fortunately, it had missed its target and hit a family home instead. Later that day, we drove into the city center, and I was blown away by the scale of the destruction. You heard Dr. Attar use the words apocalyptic wasteland. Those are the words I wrote down. And it sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. And this was 2012. The shelling was relentless. There were snipers everywhere. And I just remember the feeling of exhaustion from being so petrified all the time. And Ayman, in an effort to make me smile, bought me an ice cream. But in that moment, the only thing I could think of was, and again, I find myself using the same language that we've heard from the doctors, this is actually hell. This is what hell feels like. And there's no way it can get any worse than this. But it did. It got a lot worse. Much worse. I went back to Aleppo again at the end of this year, at the end of February in this year, so just a few months ago, and the Russian intervention had begun in September of the year before. The full force of their air power was being felt throughout the city, and you've just heard from Dr. Attar and Dr. Sahlul that medical facilities have been a favorite target. And in fact, my dear friend Ayman, the Syrian driver who I told you about, himself was killed by an airstrike while visiting a friend in a hospital, an injured friend in the city of Azaz. He's just one of many, many friends, colleagues, Syrians who I have known who have been killed. I have been covering conflict for 12 years. I have never experienced anything like Syria. The eastern rebel hell part of Aleppo, when I was there just a few months ago, was not yet completely cut off. There was one road going in and out, and it's called the Castello Road. You heard Ambassador Power refer to it. But it was still an incredibly difficult road to navigate. And when you're driving along it, you have to drive at absolute top speed because it's flanked by enemy positions on either side. And the only thing you can see, they've built these little berms of earth to try to protect, and it feels like such a feeble, futile gesture, these little berms of earth to protect cars going along from the full force of the artillery and the air power that's coming its way. And you can see these cars all along the road that have just been blown up and left abandoned. Once I got into the city, I have to say it was just breathtaking. the apocalyptic landscape had become a moonscape. There was nothing but dust, rubble, gray, entire city blocks razed to the ground. You just saw the pictures, buildings, apartment buildings with no walls, still sort of hanging, suspended there, but no walls, uninhabitable. It didn't seem like life could exist there, and yet it did. Again, as you saw in those photos, a fruit market huddled in the shadow of a burned out building. People lining up for water, which is now a precious resource in Aleppo. I sat in the apartment of an elder woman called Su'ad, who lost 3 of her sons in this war. She's blind and elderly, suffers from various health problems. Needless to say, she was not able to get the medicine that she required for quite some time. And the Sukri neighborhood that she lives in has really been bombed into the Stone Age. And what I noticed, because I talked to quite a few women there, is all of them have this slightly distant look in their eyes. They are all traumatized. And I asked Su'ad, I said, why don't you leave Aleppo? And she answered me very simply, why should I leave Aleppo? This is my home. And that's hard for us to understand, I think. And it makes it very difficult for us to understand the mentality of many of the people who are still living in eastern Aleppo. But let me explain something. The ones who have decided to stay year in and year out, who have braved the relentless bombardment day in and day out, most of them don't plan on leaving. They made a decision a long time ago that they would rather die in dignity in their homes than leave. And they've watched what's happened in other places in Syria, and they know how this movie ends. Bomb them, starve them out until they finally leave. We've seen it again and again in Homs, in Muadamiyah, in Madaya. They know what happens to the people who leave their homes. Most of them never see their homes again. Many of them are loaded onto buses and never see the light of day again. So when you talk of offers of amnesty from the Syrian army or humanitarian corridors established by the Russians, for most Aleppo residents, it's simply not an option. Because the thing that has been killed in Syria that is much more difficult to rebuild than a bombed out building is trust. There is no trust. No trust in the Assad regime, no trust in ceasefires or cessation of hostilities or humanitarian corridors, no trust in the Russians, and no trust in you, by the way, in us, in the international community, who have been wringing their hands on the sidelines while hospitals and bakeries and schools have been bombed, while phosphorus and cluster bombs have killed countless civilians. The only ones who have emerged as heroes on the ground, alongside brave doctors like Dr. Attar and Dr. Sahlul, alongside the White Helmets, are the Islamist factions, even to those who hate fundamentalism, even to those who see that the rebels themselves are carrying out atrocities. And not because the people there are all terrorists, but because the Islamists are the ones who have stepped in to fill the void. And that should not come as a surprise to anyone in this room, because all of us could see it happening as far back as 2012. So in closing, I would just say this. It's a crucial time for people of the world to address the plight of civilians in Aleppo, and I mean civilians on both sides of this conflict. Because what we have seen over the last 4 years, quite clearly, as you heard from Ambassador Power, is that neither side is able to win a decisive victory. Even now, it looks as if the rebels may have broken the siege. Tomorrow, the siege may once again be enforced. And even if the siege continues, let me tell you, this is not going to end in a week. It could take years, and tens of thousands of people could be killed. And in that equation, the use of the word victory seems almost sick. As I said before, I've been a war correspondent for more than 10 years. I have been to Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, and every terrible conflict that you can think of. I have never seen anything on the scale of Aleppo. There are no winners in Aleppo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. I now give the floor to members of the Security Council, starting with the ambassadors who have co-sponsored this session, to whom we're very grateful. And we will start with the United Kingdom, Peter Wilson.
Thank you, Samantha. Look, I'm not going to speak for long, and frankly, after hearing after hearing all of that, it's almost hard to speak at all. I do want to say on behalf of my government, thank you. I want to thank the speakers who have given so much and who continue to give so much. I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Salul, Dr. Attar, for what you've shared with us. It was extremely hard to sit through what you have just shown us. I also want to thank Abdullah Kalwa for the testimony that he gave with guns playing in the background. And I want to thank you, Clarissa, as well, for the witness that you have borne and for the message that you have given us. It couldn't have been clearer. Which is why I recognize that thanking you is frankly not enough. The question before us as a Security Council is, are we doing enough? And the answer, frankly, is no. The answer is no, because we have heard that humanitarian conditions, which have been frankly dreadful since 2012 and before, that they are deteriorating at an alarming rate. The answer is no, because the Syrian regime has not honored the agreement that it made to let aid in as part of the UN convoy plan. And the answer is no, because there is a systematic attack on medical facilities and other civilian infrastructure going on. We've heard about it just now in July. Those statistics are appalling. Eastern Aleppo, 15 hospitals attacked. So the question is, what can we do about it? First of all, there has to be a stop to the fighting, a stop to the bombing. That's the first thing that must happen. The second thing is, humanitarian access has to be complete and it has to be immediate. That is not happening. And the third thing is, the regime and its allies need to honor the promises that they have made. So stopping bombing, letting aid in, and stopping the destruction of medical supplies and medical facilities, these have to be the very basic minimum of what we do now. And without that, frankly, it is impossible to see how the politics can progress. We're all agreed that nobody can win. We're all agreed that the only thing that can be done now is a political solution. Nobody wants to set preconditions for that political solution. But it's just a matter of political will and political arithmetic that with all of this going on in front of us, it is hard to see how we make progress. I think the panelists here have shown today that they have done their part. I think now the question for us is, what can we do and how do we play ours? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. I want to encourage panelists, if there's anything that any of the speakers say that catches your ear that you want to respond to please do so. Can I just ask one please question? Yeah, of course.
And that is just a question to actually all of you, which is, how do you get in and how do you get out?
So let's take that question, and then when we've gathered a few speakers and questions, maybe people can respond. I know the answer to that question changes day by day and has changed a lot just in the few weeks since Sam and Zahar were in Aleppo. I just wanted to note that the point that Peter made about medical supplies specifically, that it has been a year or 6 months of relative progress in terms of securing humanitarian access to besieged areas. When I say relative, it means compared to basically getting almost nothing in, reaching less than 1% of the besieged in 2015, to at least being able to hit each of the besieged areas once, at least with a convoy delivery, but with way insufficient food and people who haven't been reached in more than 2 years, just one convoy is not, of course, remotely sufficient. But what I did want to flag is, even as access has been more pronounced and that we've seen a modest improvement, there has been no improvement in access of medical supplies. And indeed, the same practice of stripping the convoys of surgical equipment, of infant formula, baby milk, et cetera, persists. And it's, again, I think one of the most glaring testaments to the combination of spite, and starve and surrender tactics. And by starve, it's not just starve of food, but starve also of vital medical supplies that the regime has practiced from the beginning of the war. Okay, we now give the floor to Alexis Lemec from France.
Merci Samantha, et moi aussi je voudrais remercier chacun de nos panélistes